thank you everyone for joining. Just connecting with fellow animal advocates always charges me up, and hopefully you find the same. And I've certainly enjoyed the community that the Animal Rights Show has built and is continuing to build. And for a moment, I'd just like you to imagine you're in a beautiful park nearby, fresh air on your face, you really need to recharge, you're visiting a friend, and you're looking forward to some downtime, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, are you still doing that vegan thing? Veganism comes up, animal rights comes up. I think we've all been in this situation, and I guess first we have to decide whether we're going to engage or not, but if we do choose to engage, the next question is, what are we going to say? And I think we have various expectations around this, and please don't be too intimidated by my artwork here, but I think from an expectation perspective, we oftentimes have various intentions, the thoughts in our head, and we use these to craft our message. And the hope is that the recipient or the audience interprets the message exactly as we sent it, is thinking the exact same thing as us. We all sing Kumbaya, it's a peaceful world, and everything's solved. But I think we know this isn't reality. Reality is usually we have an intention, we send our message, and oftentimes there's 4, 5, maybe more potential interpretations the audience might have. And from an animal advocacy perspective, those are oftentimes speciesist interpretations. So it's the whole idea behind this is to ponder what those potential interpretations are. So using common movement language, I think most, if not all of us here would agree that all animal use is cruel. And this is common movement language, and so we might ask the question, are you against animal cruelty? Again, we might hope the person says, I am against animal cruelty, I should go vegan. But I think we know this isn't the case. They might say, oh yeah, I support the RSPCA, I do meat-free, so-called meat-free Mondays, or, talk about cruelty to dogs or very specific species, or, something around the lines of I only buy, quote-unquote, humane eggs, meat, dairy, all this stuff, or, I know where I shop and there's no cruelty there. So comparing that first example with another one, if we were to focus on all of animal use, we might ask the question, do you think it's using our fellow animals is morally wrong? Now again, the perfect response might be, you know what, you're right, we should oppose all animal use. But again, we're probably going to be challenged on these topics. People might say, no, but I support some kinds of, animal use, and or maybe there's certain types of animal use they think is necessary, or it's only the cruel forms of animal use, quote unquote, that I'm opposed to. And between these two examples, the whole idea isn't that there's one perfect way to do things, but I think in the first example, we're much more likely to have a treatment-based discussion, and in the second example, even if people oppose us, it's much more likely to be centered around overall animal use. So you might be thinking at this point, Jeremy, there's so much to think about as an animal advocate. I can't do one more thing. I just want to use the words I want to use in my language. And you're right, there's a lot to think about as an animal advocate. So I'd like to share a few big picture concepts that help filter all of our language through, rather than completely rewriting the whole dictionaries in our head. And because if there's a few things that we can do to improve our advocacy, such as language, the response to that I have is, why not at least try? And one of the big things I try to do with all of my advocacy and language specifically is center our fellow animals. And a simple example of this is rather than talking about, I'm vegan, saying, yes, I'm an advocate for our fellow animals. Because I think we can talk about this later maybe, but the vegan language has often shifted more towards the human-centric, a human who is vegan, rather than the underlying philosophy, which I guess is a discussion we can have with our audience too. Another key concept, which if you take nothing else from these slides, let it be this that you take home with you, is the flip it to test it method. Hopefully a few of you are already familiar with this, but if there's language that is specifically referring to our fellow animals, if we flip that and think if we were referring to humans, and I think even more powerful, minoritized group of humans, would we use the same language? And if the answer is no, there's probably a strong chance that there's better language we could be using for our fellow animals. For example, this is commonly referred to as, quote, fish. Now, if we looked at a community of them, some people might use that language, and using the flip it to test it method, if we looked at these individuals in a field, we're not likely to say, Oh, there's human. We'd say they're humans with an S at the end. Gesturing at the fact that it's a group of individuals, which is the same with the fish friends who a lot of us have grown to understand and respect. And that's just one quick example of how that flip it to test it method can work, but there's many others. And the last key thing I use throughout all my language advocacy is quote marks. Those of you in the you'll see it today. My fingers will probably get worn out with the air quotes. But whether it's spoken, written, it's one of the most powerful things I think we can do is putting things in quotes. Rather than just talking about farming, if it's spoken, saying so-called or quote-unquote farming, or just written, just putting quotes around it, because unless we're talking about plants, if we're talking about individuals, this is a euphemism for a lot of different actions wrapped up in this. So that's a few of the big pictures ideas. So what I'd like to do now is run through some specific examples, because for those of you, whether you're new to language or maybe you've been thinking about this for a while, I think it helps to kind of go through specifics. So let's get Pacific.
Just a point of order, Jeremy, that's the Atlantic, isn't it? Isn't that the Atlantic, not specific?
I don't know, it's not that Pacific.
All right, okay.
So the idea with these is not to memorize them, but really thinking about the underlying idea behind why an alternative might be considered, just to help us in our own advocacy and our own linguistic decision making. So I think a lot of us are familiar with the it language and referring to fellow animals as they, he, she, or I think even better by their name, assuming they have one. Similarly referring to them as someone versus something. And as you've noticed through this discussion, one of my favorites is our fellow animals. I also like to talk about them as individuals. Other animals is used quite often, but I think other animals is quite neutral personally. If we were advocating for a human group, we wouldn't just talk about them being another human. We might talk about them being our fellow human. So I think this just gestures it a bit more there, especially the fact that humans are animals, and building conversations from there. And we have, rather than wild animals, free-living animals, to gesture at the fact that they don't need to be tamed, presumably by humans. And also for those of you who care for dogs, cats, and others, the ownership language, you go out and you go to the so-called vet and you're filling out the forms asking who their owner is. I imagine a lot of us have done that, and really just trying to, again, refer to them by name or maybe our dog family, and taking the focus off them as a species and really highlighting the individuals, what I try to do through a lot of this. And we talked about that cruel example earlier, and I suspect the Q&A we can explore this even further, but similar language to cruelty: abuse, suffering, so-called welfare, and dare I say exploitation, I do think at least if we look at the beginning, all those potential interpretations, I think all of this language has the potential to shift towards a treatment-based interpretation. So that's why I like to focus on animal use, and perhaps a bit stronger is attaching the moral atrocities surrounding animal use, and also murder, and more objective language such as this that is hopefully going to lead people towards an objective conversation about animal use. I do talk about breeding language. I think in general we need to talk about this more as a movement, because that's where the problems begin. Because if these individuals aren't created, their treatment, their murder, and all these things down the line aren't really a factor. But I do like to say manipulate into having children when the context allows, or back to those quote marks if it doesn't. And regulated murder and rather than wildlife management. If a human, using the flip it to test approach, if a human was hit by a car, we wouldn't call them roadkill, we'd call them a traffic accident victim. I think we should do the same for our fellow animals. And similarly with the livestock market, talking about a slave auction instead. And similarly, a lot of common terms: meat, beef, pork, making this animal-centric and talking about someone's body, someone's milk, someone's eggs, wing, rib, or someone's skin. And that second example, animal product, I think is an interesting one to me, because it's commonly used by vegans, isn't it? But if our whole goal is to dismiss or dismantle the idea that our fellow animals are a product, I think the language animal product could actually be unintentionally reinforcing that they're a product. So I personally avoid it myself. Similarly, when it comes to going out to eat, rather than talking about vegan options or vegan diet, I think a lot of us are aware of how veganism has shifted almost exclusively to being interpreted as a diet by many. I like to talk about the dietary aspect of veganism. And more common movement language: love, kindness, compassion. I think there's a place for this language, but I like to ground my advocacy in respect, because we don't necessarily need to love someone to respect them enough not to manipulate them into having children, separating families, murdering them, and so on. And this last one I think is just a bit of a fun one, because oftentimes we refer to society by itself, and I think that it works well to shift the conversation from a human-centric to an animal-centric perspective, to talk about the human aspect of society, to remind ourselves that we're not the only individuals on this planet, which I think humanity can often forget. A few other ones,
I have two questions already.
Okay.
We can keep them for later if you prefer. One is, how do you feel about the word guardian for the dogs and cats in our families? And what was the second one? The use of the word flesh. Usually I say I don't eat animals, but flesh doesn't sound too bad to me. I mean, it's a bit shocking, so people pay attention when you say that to the waiter, for example.
Yeah, and that strikes at a key part here, Nella, is the having our language be digestible. Because I know I love to play around with new language, but I have to kind of not rein myself in, but pull myself in sometimes, and say, is a non-vegan audience who's maybe never thought about species as language before going to understand what I'm saying? And I think flesh is an example where they at least know. I've done a lot of alternatives around that aspect, and I quite like just referring to someone's body, when it works, I wouldn't eat someone's body, focusing on the dietary angle again. Guardian-wise is a tough one. I think it brings us back to that flip of the testant method. If we had a human roommate, what might we refer to them as? I think guardian's a lot better than a lot of the alternatives, but I like to think of the dogs who live with us as just complete equals, and try to do that through my language. And while they are dependent on me for care, I don't know, I'd probably default to just saying their names when I could, and species when necessary.
I know. I just thought that what I've done, for example, I was filling a form and I crossed out owner and I wrote guardian, because I thought that this was like the closest thing to something better that I could write down.
I like that. Yeah, and this is a great thing about language. The pursuit never ends. I think when we first start out, there's a few key, not calling other animals is one example, but it just continues to evolve through the years. I know I've been thinking about this for 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. So, yeah, I mean, even crossing them out and putting roommate would be interesting to get some interpretations of that too. I don't know. But yeah, for some of these other examples, I think common language, fishing boat, saying murder boat is really what happens on these vessels. And, rather than aquarium, talking about a water prison, zoo or zoo animal, talking about a prison for our fellow animals or zoo inmates. And I know there's discussions going back a few years, especially around the voiceless language. And while I appreciate this is meant to be more figurative rather than a literal use of the language, going back to those thought bubbles, what is a speciesist audience likely to interpret? And I think one of those would be to think that our fellow animals don't have a voice, which is why I like to say unheard, silenced, or invisibilized is probably my favorite, just to avoid that potential, interpretation. And just wrapping things up, just more general language points. I think rather than using you language, you do this, you do that, talking about we or us, such as in, we were tricked to believe, and then building on to our point. And another one that's common is talking about vegan education, or, we're going to educate you. I think this has potential classist interpretations, but I've been on the street, from the title of the slides shows, I've done over 1,000 interactions on the street, and I think this can oftentimes be interpreted as, what, I don't need educating, what are you going to educate me about? Which is why I like to talk about building awareness, which gets across a similar point. And, similar to, rather than non-vegan, I like the idea of vegan curious, to kind of hopefully encourage them to be even more curious. And back to that you language, rather than you should go vegan. One of my favorite opening questions is, have you considered veganism? I can't tell you the number of times I've asked this, and 2-3 minutes goes by where they're exploring how they've considered the topic, and you're giving them a space to do this, and usually a lot of things along the way that we can build off later in the conversation. And just an example of some fun things we can do with language, as you've noticed through this, on YouTube I identify as Jeremy the Ape, which is just a fun way to remind ourselves that humans are actually apes. Technically we're great apes, but I like to leave the great part off because I think humans have enough ego as it is without attaching great to the language. But this is just kind of a fun way to remind us that we are all animals. And so that's the main language component, but taking a big step back, I think as animal advocates, it's really helped me over the last 10 years as being vegan to put things in buckets a little bit and focus on the things we can control and the things that we can't control. And unfortunately, a lot of animal use is beyond our control. And Stoicism has really helped articulate that for me. And just through an example, we can't control the weather. These are the things that are beyond our control. If there's going to be a lightning storm, rain, cloud, or maybe sun, it's not like we can just turn a switch and change these things. But what we can do is we can put on a rain jacket, an umbrella, and the language is our umbrella. It's one example of the thing that is within our control. And reminding us to focus on the things that we can change, I think, is a lot better, just if nothing else from a sustainability perspective, to know that we are doing the things that we can. And one fun thing that Roger gestured at earlier in the conversation is our new umbrella. At the beginning of last year, we took off for 7 months in the van you see here, 19-foot converted van, Dexter, Chewy, Nish, and I, and we toured through the southeastern U.S. looking for our new micro sanctuary, and lots of factors to consider. But the big thing is we fell in love with Georgia, which is where I am now, and the big climate was the biggest factor, especially for smaller individuals, so that we don't have those super cold winter nights. But we've been busy ever since. We literally having fencing work. If you hear banging, it's because we have fencing work out here just today. So, which is our last big project, which is very exciting. So we've been doing everything we can do to get ready, and similar to our language, through our sanctuary, we're really going to focus on the individual, which I really think is the power of sanctuary, because so often in our movement, I think we're talking about fellow animals as this distant individual, whereas sanctuaries, they get to do the advocacy for themselves, which I'm very big fan of. And this will be both through in person as well as social media advocacy. But we are looking to do our new intakes here shortly, as well as individuals who are already caring for. We have a whole fish community who we care for. But yeah, if you want to follow us, we're on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, under respectanimalsanctuary.com. And look forward to connecting, because I know there's a lot of animal advocates in the group here today, and I want to connect and hear about what you're doing too. And for those who don't know, a micro sanctuary, there's no real strict definition. Typically, it focuses on species who are typically, quote, farmed, as you see in the picture here, chickens, pigs, and others. But really, the whole idea is, with a smaller space, limited time and budget, we can start to take in maybe one individual, maybe a couple, and really help relieve the strain from larger sanctuaries, which, don't get me wrong, larger sanctuaries absolutely play a pivotal role. But I think a lot of us are aware that sanctuaries are mostly at capacity, at least the ones I'm familiar with. So it hopefully just allows us to support more fellow animals, and it's just more accessible because starting a big sanctuary, and especially sustaining a big sanctuary, is not an easy ask. That's where I think the micro sanctuaries can really play a pivotal part in the movement. I think they already are, but especially in the coming years, because it's something that's accessible to most, if not all of us. So that is all I have pre-prepared. It looks like we've got a good chunk of time for an interactive Q&A, which is, as I said, is my favorite part. The two key things I'd leave you with is, if you're not already, the Unlearning Species as Language group on Facebook, started by a friend of mine a few years back. Varun is a great place to just share ideas. And it's nice because you can kind of drip feed ideas here and there, which is quite digestible, I found. But also, if you like to do a deep dive to build on a lot of the ideas explored here, on my website, begininteractions.com, I've got a free language document, which has been kind of my amalgamation of language thoughts over the past several years, and I try to update that regularly. So with that, thank you so much for all of you as fellow animal advocates for all you do, and yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, before we move on from vegan interactions, I've been asked by the vegan filmmaker Andy Atkinson to say how brilliant he found the website, because he was going to try and do something similar to that, and he thought, well, the best thing to do with my website is just linked to this one on this particular, on a set of topics. And so he wanted me to point that out to you, that he found it really, really good. So that's a good recommendation, folks. That's Andy, who probably a lot of people will be familiar with.
Oh, thanks so much, Andy.
Yeah, sure.
That means a lot.